Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and I am running for Arlington Public School Board. And although I was born in the Garden State, which would probably make me a Yankee carpetbagger, I can attest to at least some ties to the old Dominion state of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Having received my bachelor's degree in the beautiful Shenandoah at what is reputed to be the 9th-ranked liberal arts college in the nation and the most competitive college in this state, Washington University in Lexington. And it was there that I met a man by the name of John Gunn, who was perhaps the most intelligent person who I had ever met by that point in my educational development. John Gunn was a professor of economics, one of the toughest professors at that elite private school, and he had studied at Princeton University in New Jersey, where he was so intelligent and respected by their distinguished faculty that he often would be invited to dine in the faculty dining room, exchanging witty replies and conversations with notables like Albert Einstein and Gunnar Myrdal. And you have to be pretty smart if you can actually have a meal with Albert Einstein. And not just in casual acquaintance, but also through classroom instruction. I actually had the privilege and honor to be a student in John Gunn's spring term course, short term, on the history of economic thought, which served as the connection to understanding a current pandemic pathogen that of at least report has even baffled the best scientists. It is often said the first impression is the last, and I can still recall the first day of class, and with an impeccable reputation for non-attendance, also my last day in class with John Gunn for that course. But I can recall that he told a joke at the very beginning that was of sufficient interest to remember about three scientists who had been stranded on a deserted island, a chemist, a physicist, and an economist, who had to consider the vexing problem of sustenance, having managed to salvage only one can of beans before being shipwrecked. And their mission, should they choose to accept it, under evolutionary pressure of simple subsistence and survivability, was to discover a method to open the tin can to enable them to consume its contents for sustaining nourishment, to last just a little bit longer. The natural scientists relied upon their experience and training of their chosen academic disciplines to derive formulas and to develop a hypothesis on how to resolve their dilemma, all of which proved to be unsatisfactory, especially for the economist, a learned man in the social sciences. And the economist, therefore, announced his perfect solution, cheddar experiments. Simply assume a can opener, a punchline that produced a jolly and prideful belly laugh from John Gunn, but only managed to elicit polite laughter from the class, who just couldn't understand. And for the prideful economist, at least, the joke served as a vindication for the superiority of the social sciences. Yet intriguingly, this nostalgic vignette provides a segue to the present complexities in a pandemic pathogen that has wrought devastation around the world because of its focus on what all scientists and even decision makers in policy and business and even the military describe as assumptions, because at the very beginning of the emergence of a pneumonia of unknown etiology, there were a series of not just empirical findings based upon observations, but also critical assumptions that dictated and ordered its ensuing path. Place yourself in the position of a problem solver. Just like any student being administered a test, be it the SOL, the PSAT, the ACT, or the SAT. What is the first step in any problem-solving exercise? Bueller, anyone? Recognize that you have a problem. And if you have two number 2 lead pencils, an answer sheet with a whole bunch of circles on it in front of you, and an examination book, you can check yes or affirmative to the answer, Houston, we have a problem. But what is your next step when being administered the examination? Whether you are in reading comprehension or analytical reasoning or even logical reasoning on the LSAT, like any ace detective, you're probably first going to try to discover what? The facts or the evidence, those things that are known. But after that, Sherlock Holmes, with the facts laid out before you, are you going to apply your deductive reasoning skills, or are you going to do something else? Elementary, my dear Watson, you're actually not going to deduce from the evidence that is known, going from the general to the specific, but actually attempt to engage in logical reasoning in an orderly and methodological progression from that which is specific and known and empirically established to infer, going up, a conclusion that applies generally, or what is actually rightly termed and understood inductive reasoning, despite what you may have heard in the Sherlock Holmes movie. And that is exactly what some scientists actually did in the Hubei province back in December 2019. They examined the evidence from specific cases of what they had described as a pneumonia of unknown etiology, a medical phenomenon. We don't know what it is, and quickly inferred, note not deduced, but inferred from their immediate observations that the fact pattern appeared most akin, most resembled, most analogous to something with which they were generally familiar, the SARS outbreak in Hong Kong back in 2003. And immediately began thereafter isolating and identifying new cases based upon that general template. Individual cases to them, upon appearance, initially looked like, for purposes of sorting and sorting only, they might be tossed in that general SARS basket. But at that early stage, these clinicians were only using the SARS template to distinguish those cases, those pneumonia cases, from other cases that were coming in the door. And they still had reason to believe at that point that what was presenting in medical cases some condition that had many similar facets and asymptomatic signs and symptomatic presentation to that which they professed some familiarity, specifically SARS, which they had seen before, but which was still somehow a little different, requiring what? More tests. Have to send out the investigative team again. In military intelligence, we say that intelligence drives the mission cycle, and these clinicians now had a preliminary hypothesis or educated guess with which they were enabled to begin a follow-on search for additional evidence to gain a better understanding of the new emerging pathogen and to discover more about its nature and causation. And with this more refined understanding, approximately 1,800 teams, we are told, of at least 5 trained epidemiologists were dispatched to begin not only identifying new cases, but also to examine the tracer contacts arising from those cases in a systematic and logical manner to determine a preliminary assessment not only of the incidence and prevalence of the emerging pathogen, bonus points if you know the difference between incidence and prevalence, but also to develop an estimate of its secondary attack rate, or what proportion of tracer contacts were becoming infected by persons known to be infected. The operative theory was that a person who is infected will, more likely than not, like typhoid Mary, infect those persons with whom he or she comes into contact. They're radioactive. If they are infected with a communicable disease being transmitted from person to person. But what did they find in China? Examining over 55,000 cases in China, those empirical, fact-based examinations could not even find a secondary attack rate of 5%, 4 times too low in statistical significance to validate the existence of a communicable disease, and 12 times too low to set off a super spreader event. And 55,000 laboratory confirmed cases is a large sample size, which should establish some level of confidence in those empirically determined results. And in that extensive 40-page report, the World Health Organization stated specifically, based upon these empirical findings, quote, "It is not clear whether this correlates with the presence of an infectious virus." It is not clear whether this correlates with the presence of an infectious virus. And that is the evidence-based empirical conclusion for pathology of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and disease condition of COVID-19 in China. revalidated by the largest sample size tracer contact study to date performed in India in October. Over 3 million laboratory confirmed cases, less than 5%, not an infectious disease. However, in that same report, there are 3 short paragraphs, all based upon assumptions that altered the path of that pathogen, validated to exhibit a less than 5% infectiousness on page 10, entitled Transmission in Wuhan. And the first sentence states, early cases in Wuhan are believed to be acquired infection from a zoonotic source, as many reported visiting or working in the Hunan wholesale seafood market. Let's think about that. A less than 5% infectious pathogen that zoonotically evolved at the Hunan wholesale seafood market, a venue measuring the size of 9 American football fields. We're looking at the empirical observations now, and where even at that time of this report, it was known that only a total of 27 cases, all vendors, were infected, and there is no mathematical probability nor scientific theory that can logically conclude or infer from that evidence that that pathogen, even if zoonotically evolved, would have gone any further than those 27 infected persons if their sickness was caused by a less than 5% infectious pathogen. But denying the science and inferring from the larger spread that is going around the world, this report credits a zoonotic evolution with setting off a public health crisis in Wuhan, relying only upon bad assumptions. Next sentence. As of 25 February, an animal source has not yet been identified. Even to this date, an animal source has not been identified. But the zoonotic evolution theory continues to be the dominant narrative, especially in the press, based upon a false assumption, using deduction, not inductive reasoning. Next sentence. At some point early in the outbreak, some cases generated human-to-human transmission chains that seeded the subsequent community outbreak prior to the implementation of comprehensive control measures that were rolled out in Wuhan. This is a sentence in the same report where it was determined that COVID-19 was not even an infectious disease. Next sentence. The dynamics likely approximated mass action and radiated from Wuhan to other parts of Hubei province and China, which explains a relatively high R0 of, or R subscript 0 of 2 to 2.5. R0 is what epidemiologists and some virologists describe as a reproductive number. And by saying that the R0 is 2 to 2.5, this sentence totally discarded the empirical finding that COVID-19 had been validated as having a less than 5% secondary attack rate, or that an infected person may, more likely than not, fail to infect 95 out of 100 people with whom he or she come into close contact, and makes the assumption rather based on what? Induction or deduction? Deduction that he or she will actually infect at least 2 to 2.5 close trace contacts once infected. But based upon what? It is a metadata deductive analysis based upon actually what SARS, remember the basket that we put this in? Based on what SARS did before, prior to an evolving science and pandemic, had generally been rejected as not accurate by any credible scientist who would have used not reproductive number, but rather secondary attack rate. Yet this section concluded that the cordon sanitaire around Wuhan and neighboring municipalities imposed since January 23, 2020 has effectively prevented further exportation of infected individuals to the rest of the country. The cordon sanitaire around Wuhan saved the world, according to this report. So why do we have a pandemic trying to open the schools again? Based on your observation.
I believe it's one of the most ghostly manifestations that I have ever seen. Whether it is real or simply conjecture, one of those things that people seeking to find some mystery to fool themselves into believing, but with some other perfectly rational cause, is a question that only you can answer with your capacity for reason. Impossible? So was Xeroxing and holography just a few years ago. In fact, so were videotape replays like the one you're watching right now. People have been claiming an existence of God for thousands of years, and maybe one day we will finally know the answers as to how and why and what. What a tremendous gain that would be for science, but what a tragic loss for storytelling. No one knows the day nor the hour when all mysteries shall be revealed, but we'll be watching and we'll be waiting in earnest, incessant, and fervent prayer for the advancement of the kingdom of God. Be sure to join us next time as events evolve with science and faith in a pandemic election that some have claimed is the presidential election of their lifetime.
This is a no-brainer, folks. It doesn't get any easier than this. My name is Major Mike Webb. By God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. If it is to be, it is up to somebody to tell you to do what to do. Let me know how that works out. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb. End of the day, I really don't give a damn. It's not my department. Honest. And y'all go back now. Here. Honest.